When I got the iPad Pro in 2018, I ran a week-long test. Could it replace my MacBook Pro at my teaching job? And the honest answer was no. The experience was pretty poor, the apps weren't quite there, and iPadOS just felt kind of underbaked. But it's been 5 years since then. iPadOS has grown up, the apps have grown up, and all the accessories and ecosystem around it has grown up. So in this video, I wanted to talk about all the good things, all the bad things, and all the things which I really think need to change with iPads. So let's get into it. My biggest takeaway of using the iPad for all of this time is it's just not for everyone, and that's totally okay. If you find yourself trying to force the iPad into your workflow or trying to find a use for it here or there, maybe it's fine to just admit it's not for you. As a whole, if you want to use the iPad solely, it's a really niche computer, but it does work really well for some people. I want to give an example here because I have a friend who runs a tattoo studio and she does absolutely everything through the iPad, from sketching out designs to contacting customers to taking payments and everything else around it. The iPad is the only computer she needs and uses, and it works incredibly well for her. It does loads of stuff which a laptop specifically couldn't unless you added loads of accessories for it. And I know she couldn't imagine using any other computer to run her business or just to get her work done. Now, I'm not one of those people. It's a very niche example, and for all of the creative stuff I do, I really do need to jump to a Mac. But for some people, the kind of iPad works at like 120%. It's just absolutely everything they could ever want and specifically designed for it. Let's talk about some good things though, because there is loads here which I did want to highlight. And one of the biggest things is that iPadOS is kind of an evolving sort of ecosystem and OS. It's not like a laptop where things have been set out for years. iPads seem to continually change over time. One of the huge examples of that was getting external monitor support and Stage Manager. We all bought an iPad before any of that was even kind of talked about, and the fact that it came as a free software update and we can now use iPad pretty much as a desktop computer is an amazing thing to get. The other thing I really like about it as well is it's kind of adaptive computing. You can use this on a touch basis if you want. You can use this with a keyboard and with a touchpad if you want, or you can use the Apple Pencil if you want, or you can connect a mouse, or you can put it as your desktop setup. It does quite a few different things, which is really interesting. And because that OS is evolving, it's always changing its capabilities. And even though the hardware design hasn't changed drastically in 5 years, it's held up incredibly well. I've still got my original iPad Pro from 2018, and it's still fast and snappy and handles pretty much every application I throw at it. It is locked out of some features, unfortunately, like the external monitor support with Stage Manager, but the fact that it's still running everything else really slickly is good. And that leads us into kind of my favorite uses for the iPad. Over these 5 years, these are the ones that I kind of keep coming back to because I think the iPad just does such a good job of it. And the leading one for that is digital note taking. I love taking handwritten notes on the iPad. It's an absolutely wonderful way to use the piece of technology, and the amount of features you get now with note taking apps is just awesome. I absolutely love planning and researching and kind of coming up with video ideas all on the note taking apps on iPad. It's a true joy. And I love editing photos on here in Lightroom. Playing around with photos by actually touching them and moving things feels really kind of reminiscent of using a darkroom. And we also use it a lot here at Heroku for kind of all of our product designs. So much of what we make and do starts off on an iPad in Procreate, whether that's just a sketch or bringing ideas together or kind of mood boarding stuff. It's just a really wonderful place to do it. Another one of the big ones for me is using it in my desk setup with universal control. Now, I've made whole videos on this and talked about it a lot before, but having my iPad set up next to my Mac on a stand and then using my same keyboard and mouse to control the iPad as well as the Mac is just so good. I absolutely love that, and I use it for things like checking my notes when I'm editing a video or browsing mobile apps or just dragging and dropping files between the two. And since using it like that, it's kind of changed my entire workflow. And sometimes when it's set up like that, I'll use it for really simple things like watching videos or listening to lo-fi. And actually, talking of lo-fi, if you do like that sort of music, we've just released another set of lo-fi music over on Heroku Radio, which is the sister channel to this one. So if you want to get some work done to some kind of chill Zelda vibes, go and check it out. I'll link it below. The one thing I really wish Apple would lean into, and the iPad as a whole though, is gaming. Gaming on the iPad itself is a pretty decent experience. Even with touch controls, you can play lots of games and it's not bad at all. And the controller support you get now is great. But when you plug the iPad into an external monitor, you still don't get a great experience. It's just kind of boxed off, or it won't go full screen or anything like that. And I think that's a huge shame. Could you imagine plugging this in and turning off the iPad screen itself and just getting a full external monitor to play games on, that would be awesome. You can connect a controller to it, and this would be like a Switch or like a Steam Deck or anything like that, where you could just sit down and play some games without the iPad being on. But it's still so limited. There's so much potential in here for it to be a complete gaming champion. The new chips in the iPhone 15 Pro showed us that they can do things like ray tracing now, which is just mad. Imagine if there was like a dock and like an Apple controller or something like that, where you could just have everything plugged in and set up and ready to go and have this awesome gaming experience on your iPad. It would be awesome. Before we carry on, I wanted to talk about the sponsor of this video, ESR. This is the Shift series case for iPad, which is magnetically powered to bring you 6 different modes all in one useful case. There's a standard viewing mode, which is great for general use. You can then raise it to get a much nicer viewing angle for consuming content, a portrait mode for better browsing or FaceTime experiences, and it can then shift down into a writing or drawing mode for a more comfortable session. If you want, you can then detach it from the stand altogether if you need to take your iPad somewhere while it remains protected. And also there's the aptly named fridge mode, which uses magnets within the case to let you attach your iPad to a fridge if you're cooking or anything else like that. For me, it's been the lockers we have here in the studio, which work really nicely with it. All these use cases have earned it a Red Dot Award for design, but for me, I'm just glad they thought about the Apple Pencil. There's still full support for wireless charging here, and there's also a neat holder on the back so it doesn't go walkabout when you slip it into a bag. If you are looking for a more classic style case though, then ESR have you covered here with the Hybrid Case 360, which features 5 unique modes and a detachable magnetic cover. So if you want to check any of these out, then head to the link in the description below. And of course, a huge thank you goes out to ESR for sponsoring this video. Over this period of time of using it as well, I've kind of discovered there's now 3 essential accessories for an iPad, in my opinion. First up is the pencil. It's such a good way to interact with the iPad, and you don't have to be an artist. I'm not an artist, but if you use it for any form of writing or for more kind of very specific input, I think it's awesome. And you don't have to buy Apple's one here. You can buy a £20 version of it called like a Meta Pen or something, and you can still get a great experience. The second one is a keyboard of some sort. Once again, the Apple ones are great, but you don't need to spend that much money. You can get another keyboard from Amazon, which does a pretty decent job. And that does give it that more kind of laptop-like experience, which is useful if you're taking your iPad on the move. And finally, which is more of a latest one, at least for me, is getting some form of stand. There's so many stands to pick from now and to choose from, and I've tried out so many. There's probably a video in there somewhere about it. But a stand really lets you use the iPad in a bigger desktop experience in a really nice way. I love it for universal control, like I've said, but having it next to your computer monitor in a desktop setup has been such a great experience, and I'd really recommend everybody give it a go. Even if you just need a more comfortable position for watching stuff or for playing games, stands are great and there's loads to pick from now. So that's kind of 5 years of good stuff and stuff I like, but let's talk about the stuff which I think needs improvement or stuff which I think is just not great. I find that big updates don't always feel complete out the gate, and that's a real shame. And I'm going to pick on external monitor support again, because when this was released, it was so buggy, and it still is. Lots of apps don't scale properly, there's all sorts of UI elements all over the place, and there's loads of little things like the browser continually pushing you to apps, and little menu things popping up on the iPad when they should pop up on the external monitor. It's still a little bit of a mess now, and it's in a full release. Oh, and it still glitches out occasionally too, which is just kind of frustrating. Also, when you plug in accessories through USB-C, it's like a Russian roulette on whether that's going to work or not. Some things work flawlessly, which is awesome, but sometimes you'll plug in an adapter or a sound card or anything like that, and it won't work to its full intent, or sometimes it just won't outright work at all. And that brings me to the Files app as well. The Files app on iPad is good, and I'm glad it's there, but there's something about it which just feels so kind of wrong. It's like they had to put Files app on the iPad because everyone asked for it, but the way it works just doesn't feel up there, and it always feels like a weird version of what Finder is. So I'm not overly keen on that either. Let's just talk about things now which I think really need to change with the iPad, and that starts with the lineup. It's such a mess at the moment. There's the iPad 9th gen, the 10th gen, the iPad mini, the iPad Air, the iPad Pro, the iPad Pro 12.9 inch. That's a lot of iPad models, and I made a buyer's guide recently, which I'll link up here if you'd like to see it, but I had to put all of these iPads into kind of my own category graph to kind of give an example of what people should buy, because it's really quite difficult at the moment to recommend the right iPad for the right person, and all of those iPads have different features and different inputs and different accessories which work, which makes the whole kind of setup a bit of a nightmare. And I saw a tweet recently that kind of simplified the iPad lineup, which I think could work really well. Maybe it's just iPad and iPad Air and then iPad Pro and get rid of everything else around it. That might be really helpful. Or just call the iPad 10th gen the iPad SE and then have the iPad SE, the iPad which comes in the mini size or the normal size, and then the iPad Pros. Just keep it a bit more simple so it's easier for everyone else to choose one. Something else which I wish I would change, and I just touched on it, is that I wish the software just felt completely final before it came out, because a lot of the time it doesn't. And I know I've talked about the iPad being an adaptive computer, and I really think it is. But sometimes when software comes out and it kind of doesn't feel quite right, it makes the whole thing more complicated to use. And lastly, I really think they should lean into gaming on this. Apple making a huge push on gaming on the Mac at the moment, and honestly, I almost think the iPad's more destined to be there, so lean into it. The other thing which has come up a lot on the internet lately is people saying that the iPad is kind of like a dead system, and it feeling like Apple's not paying loads of attention to it. I don't think that's strictly true. We got loads of updates through iPadOS last year and this year, and I assume that they'll do loads more over the next few years. Like I said, this isn't a standard computer, so the fact that it's getting all sorts of different software updates is kind of a good thing. And I see so many people ask now for macOS to be on it, but could you imagine if it was? It would be such a mess. They'd have to rejig macOS and make loads of stuff really big, and it would look awful on the desktop, and then it would be weird on the iPad, and you'd have this weird iPad version of Mac OS which just wouldn't feel right. Also, then what would become of the MacBook? And you could say that's cynical because Apple just want to sell you both, and yes, of course they do, but I think it's better than being completely separated and working together when they need to, not being the same thing. The bigger change I think Apple need to make to kind of give the iPad a more, I guess, brighter future is tightening that lineup and also giving like really clear use cases for each one, because when you go on Apple's website, it's kind of all over the place. There's no kind of, this is for this person, this is for this person, and this is for this person. It's kind of like, here's all the things it can do with no kind of really heavily specific examples, which I really think they could lean into. Cool, so 5 years down the line, do I recommend people buy an iPad now? And I've kind of had the similar motto on this for ages, and I'll reiterate it again. I think you should only get an iPad as a kind of companion device to your main computer. I don't think you should run an iPad on its own unless you fit into that very small niche of people, like I mentioned earlier, that could completely make it work. For me and for loads of other people out there, the iPad is this wonderful companion device which kind of elevates your overall computing experience, but it's not a completely necessary buy unless you've got this kind of specific use case in mind, like an artist or something like that. I also think with the new M1 MacBooks which came out and all of the Apple Silicon stuff, so much was addressed about the MacBooks in that kind of short space of time that it made the iPads kind of less attractive. MacBooks with Apple Silicon now have incredible battery life, incredible screens, and like incredible power, which is all something the iPad had, which back then the MacBooks didn't. But the fact you can now get all of that in a MacBook for a similar price kind of makes the iPad a bit of a buy for people who just want a kind of laptop that's going to last all day. So that wraps up 5 years with the iPad and everything I've kind of learned and like and don't like. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you're using the iPad for anything really specific, or if you're just using it as a complete replacement for any other computer, let me know in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next one.